So a lot of writers, including myself recently, have been kind of struggling with creation in a time of crisis. And I know that you have written books through some very turbulent times, including when you were living in New York when 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
Um, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the things that you have done to stay focused over the years.
I learned, I guess, because I began writing in terms that I thought of as writing when my parents were going through a true bloodletting of a divorce. And the way I dealt was to go in my room and close the door and work on whatever story I was doing at the time. And as the years went on, if I was fighting with my mother and could get away, I'd work on something in my head while I was walking down some country road. And I relied on that a great deal. And then when I was in college and began to write as I regarded as an adult, and I had just finished and did not have a job, was living on my boyfriend's generosity, looking for work, not finding any for a long time, really tied up in a knot, I got the idea for a book about a girl who disguises herself as a boy to become a knight. And through all the days of recession, which was what New York State was in at the time, in the late 1980s, and through that and moving to Idaho, and the recession was still on, and I got a job, but it was stressful. I was working in a group home for girls, but I was also wanting to show them what I had found by writing, by grabbing whatever amount of creativity I had and grabbing it and doing something with it, because paying attention to my everyday world had just about driven me nuts. So I showed them what I was doing, and they in turn began to work on their own writing projects. So I knew it worked. And I knew that by focusing on what I was writing instead of what was going on in the world outside, I didn't stress so much, I didn't panic so much. I could exist through poverty, joblessness, homelessness. It's what made me keep going. And the second time it happened was I was working on, I think it was the third Kell book.
Fourth, I think it was.
Fourth, where she's in command of a settlement for refugees from a border war. And I had her set up, I plan out my stories well in advance and then adjust them as I go. This time I had known for at least a year, maybe two, that there was going to come a point where she was placed in charge of a refugee camp. And at some point she was to leave the camp in the charge of her subordinates and go to the central military base where the commander of the area was and report to him. And while she was away, the war was going to come home to her people, and the enemy was going to attack the camp, and she was going to come home the next day to ruined gates and soot marks on the walls and bodies, and the discovery that I think 80 or 90 of her people were prisoners and had been taken away. And the night before 9/11, I finished up, and Kel was on the road on her way home. She had reported to her commander-in-chief. The friends who had gone to report with her were with her. They had received no word whatsoever because this had just happened. I mean, literally, the ashes were still hot. And I knew what was going to happen the next day, but it was fiction. So I went to bed, and the next morning, my husband and I had just gotten up, and we had the radio on, WQXR, in New York City. That's where we lived at the time, on the Upper West Side. And the DJ, who was normally in flappable classical music, said, "We have news. It appears a small cargo plane has crashed into one of the buildings, the World Trade Center." And my husband is a sound sleeper, which is saying the least. He evolves, and he went from amoeba to man in the space it took him to go from the bed to the television and turn the television on. And for the rest of the day, we either watched the news coverage or got in touch with our friend who was living painfully close to the World Trade Center, just over the barrier they set up to allow no one past. So that was scary until we got hold of her. And then we just watched and touched bases. Our families were calling because they didn't live in New York. They wanted to know how they were. I was remembering a couple weeks before my husband had been working there, Raquel and I had gone down there to take a boat across the river to our favorite restaurant and do some shopping over across the river from there and come back through there. And toward the afternoon, we decided we had to go for a walk, and we went out. And I have never heard the Upper West Side ever so quiet. There were people sitting on their doorsteps on the side streets, talking to people who were coming by, talking to their friends quietly, very quietly. No cars. They were all off the roads. No traffic. And then when we came back, I saw what I thought at first were ghosts down the road, down the street. It was the people who had walked up from the World Trade Center because they had no other way to get up to their homes on the Upper West Side. And they were covered in white dust. They looked like ghosts. I was not able at that point to write for 2 weeks. I couldn't face what I knew I had to go back to with the book, which was destruction and missing people. And I finally decided I had a deadline. I had to find some way to get at my material again. And with those images in my head, I sat down. And it took me about 10 days to write 10 pages or so of manuscript to get me past the worst of it. And then I was okay, and I finished the book, and I cried. And I was doing the rewrites, and I cried. But that's what it was like for us then. And that was when you saw New Yorkers bringing sandwiches to the stations for the medical people and the firemen and the cops and anybody who was working to help to dig out things, to conduct traffic, to help people who were hurt, to just get them fed, get them water, get them to a doctor if they needed one, help the people who made it out. And some of us were just witnesses to what had happened. When we went down to our friend Raquel's, the one who lived at 14th Street, not that far away, we found that she lived next to St. Vincent Hospital. And people were coming by and putting photographs of the persons they could not find on the walls of the hospital. And somebody tried to come and say, no, this is a public building, you can't do that. And finally, the hospital people came out and said, no, let them do it. They have nowhere else to put these pictures. It's all destroyed. And they filled up the walls of St. Vincent's on the ground level and crossed the 2 streets to the big empty parking lot that was there. And they did the chain link fence with those pictures and those notes to the people. Call so-and-so, come home, praying for you. And those remained on that fence. St. Vincent's took theirs down after about a year, but the others remained on their fence until they took it down. But it was 2 or 3 years. So we had that reminder every time we went there. And the next year, or no, later that year, I had a book coming out. And they sent me on tour. It was my first author tour. And it was set in my other universe. And in it, my kids are dealing, they're adults. They're not adults, they're 16, 17. But they're traveling with their teachers out into the world, working their magic. And I was going to be in Minneapolis, and I'd already found out by then that everyone, but everyone, was going to ask me about 9/11. They all of us from New York who went on tour that month, because October is a book month and it's a very big deal. And I had forgotten that the reading I picked, see, Daja, my hero, her magic is with fire of any kind. And she comes into a city, and turns out there is someone out there who's deliberately setting fires. This is all something I wrote 2.5, 3 years before. But this person is setting fires. I was working off a California fire chief, a hero for getting fires stopped before they could do damage. But to do that, it turned out he'd been starting some of them. So that's what my base was. And what I was reading was my hero Daja is somewhat immune to fire because it's her magic. And this guy had set fire to a sort of a residential hotel for women. And it was burning, and the girls outside said, "Oh my God, so-and-so is in there. She can't come out. She's blind." And they weren't going to go in because smoke was coming out of everything. And Daja goes in and finds the girl and brings her out of the smoke-filled building. And I was fine up until I got up to the podium and put my reading down in front of me and realized, after having talked to the guests and there were some reporters there about New York, what I had set up for myself to read. And to this day, I don't know how I got through it. I had to stop several times. But I was talking about arsonists. I mean, to not read it, and I don't know what I would have picked, because readings, you have to pick something that's a specific length of time that won't bore the listeners silly. My first reading, I didn't judge my reading correctly, and it wasn't very lively. But this was, so I caught myself coming and going. And now we come to this. And the thing that always catches me at times like this, when so many people are in need and so many people need to help, is that there are people out there who would much rather destroy and much rather fight and much rather argue than do anything for those who need the help. That's what gets me. So until that stops, I guess there's going to be some element of that. As it is in the book I'm working on now, Aram and his friends get called to do rescue work for a series of fires caused by an earthquake. So it's still on my mind. But until we learn that the only people who benefit by these sorts of things, nobody benefits. Not the people from that country, not the people from this political party, not the people from that political party, not the people who live in the streets, not the people who live in, well, no, they maybe do. We're all in this together. And if we don't owe each other the courtesy to say, okay, cessation of hostilities here. Let's get the job done. We can straighten it out later. There are people who need us to take care of them. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter what religion they are, what color they are. It doesn't matter where they come from. There are people out there who need help. Why are we not out there helping them? Why are you sitting there counting goodie points in Congress or church when there are kids and grandparents and people who are ill who need your help? Stop sniping, stop hating. Remember, first, last, and always, you're a human being, and so are they. And we owe each other our help. That's my attitude. I have been informed that I'm a bit of a dreamer. But that's okay, because I'm a pain in the butt of a dreamer. So I make that work for me.
So would you say, it's clearly everything is weighing on you right now.
Me? Wait? Nonsense! I'm swell with everything that's going on in Washington and India and France, and I don't even know what's going on in Africa. I don't like how quiet Africa has been, because that always means something bad. We've heard very little from Africa.
That is true.
And I'm just waiting for a collection of shoes to drop, because they were fighting other things before this happened.
How do you continue to be productive with all of that? And what would you say to people who just can't be right now?
I say you have to go with what you feel. Because whatever else happens, if you are creative, your creativity is going to be there. I had writer's block for 5 years. I thought I was never going to write again. And when I began to write again, I wasn't writing at a teen level as I was when I stopped writing fiction, I'm talking about now. I was writing at the adult level I'd have been at if I'd been writing fiction all along. That part of you still creates. It still works. It will come when it's worked out whatever hitch it's got in its get along. And while you're out there being stuck, you're reading books, you're watching television, you're watching movies, you're listening to music, you're going to new places, meeting new people, discovering new skills. You are doing all this stuff that seems to have nothing whatsoever to do, most of the time, with what you were creating, what you may create. But in fact, if you go back, once your creativity comes back, and you're looking for something, and you start digging through the piles of, well, what was this? What was this? Where was I here? What was that? I remember I was looking for a haunting, bigger than life, terrifying place for my very first book, for my 2 kids to get into. And I couldn't think of anything. And then I read, and I'm blanking on the book now, but it was written in the 60s, and it was about an older man who ended up interacting with these different college-age people who were caught up in the 60s and everything that was going on. And one was a dropout from, one was a runaway from the army, and another guy got in trouble over marching for equal rights for blacks. And he traveled with these people around the world and saw what happened. And the Jewish kid went to Israel, and he heard about this new game that the Israeli boys were playing. Maybe the girls, but the writer didn't mention them if they were. Going up to the Red City, where they would cross the border into Jordan, which was illegal, and they'd be shot if they were caught, and go to this Red City, all of stone, just because it was there. And I heard the place's name was Petra. And the idea of that city carved out of red stone in a canyon stuck with me, and for years I looked for stuff about it. I didn't know what its real name was. I didn't know where exactly it was, but I looked and looked and looked, and I was watching Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in the theater, and they go riding around that corner of the wall, and they come upon I knew the name by then. It was Petra. And they came up upon the treasury carving in the wall. And I jumped up in my seat and started screaming and pointing and yelling, "That's Petra, that's Petra, that's Petra." I had my old abandoned city of the great race that was gone, except not really, because they've turned nasty and they go after our kids who have to fight what are technically gods. And that sort of made my first book fly. And then I got stuck again. Oh yeah, Briar and Rosethorn when I got to my Circle of Magic books. I wanted, Rosethorn and Briar are my 2 green mages. Their magic works with plants and green and growing things and farming and dyeing with green plants for dyes. And they came to this desert city that had been there for centuries. And it's dying. The old part of it is dying. And I thought, Petra, because I'd seen all these pictures of the buildings dug into the stone walls. And so the oldest part of my city became that, where all the poor people were shunted into these tunnels, basically, that were the original city for what I had. And then Briar and Rosethorn end up discovering a girl whose magic works with stone. And they have to get her out of several assorted jams, being these kids can't seem to avoid jams. So once again, Petra came through with me. And a friend of mine said when he gave me my copy of the book, I think it was Peter at Books of Wonder, he says, now next time you're actually going to have to go there before you write about it.
So in terms of
Did I give you an idea any way?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the question of, talk about when you had writer's block. And you don't, never mind, you don't have to.
No, it was a very bad time. See, I'd won a speech contest, an essay contest in 4th grade, and I'd gotten a good grade in 6th grade for something, both times for something I'd written. And it was in 6th grade, and my dad caught me telling stories to myself while I did the dishes. And rather than say, Tammy, people will think you're nuts if you talk to yourself, my dad, who was a genuine vocal storyteller from a long line of storytellers, he said, I think you should write a book. And I thought my dad walked all his life on water. If he was suggesting I try this book thing, I was going to give it a whirl. And the thing that really made it stuck, he said I could use his typewriter. Now, if I had laid my hand on his typewriter before that moment, I would be missing at least a finger now. Because he did his union newsletter on the typewriter. It was his. It was death to touch the typewriter. I knew that if he said I could use it, this writing thing was a big deal to him. My dad thought it was important and that I could do it. So I sat down and I started to one finger at a time. And that's pretty much how I still write today. I do several more fingers, but I never did learn to type with both hands. No, I do both hands, just not all fingers. And I thought, also he said, I don't know, write something you like. And I thought, I really love time travel. And I really loved history. And I thought, I could pretend I went back in time to the Trojan War, which was one of the things that floated my boat at the time. And I started the story about traveling in a time machine. And my dad moved out and my parents got a divorce, and my father took the typewriter, but I was hooked by then. And in 7th grade, my homeroom teacher introduced me to J.R.R. Tolkien. And I was off to the races, the Fellowship of the Ring. And I consumed pad after pad after pad of paper, writing by hand. I had a friend and we traded our writing back and forth. And my parents' divorce was a really, really ugly one. It affected us, all 3 of us kids, deeply. And my mother had a few issues and some substance problems. And I didn't figure it out for years and years and years why she felt she had to cut the ground out from under me when it came to writing so much. Because she had always held it over us that she was an English major and she knew about books and about writing, about literary stuff. She was the court of last resort. And one day she was fighting with me about that fantasy junk. Oh boy, fantasy and science fiction. She hated them. Don't get me wrong. I learned a lot from my mother. She was a brilliant woman in a lot of ways. And I learned a lot of history from her, a lot about the women's movement, a lot about art. But when it came to this one subject, as far as I was concerned, as far as my father was concerned, as far as a bottle of alcohol goes, my mother would turn into a monster, an abusive one, psychically for me and physically for my sisters. And that day, I brought her the whole box I had piled up of stories that were pretty much unfinished, but I had started a bunch of them. And she looked through them all and gave them her educated commentary about each and every one. Copy so-and-so is unclear. It went on and on and on. And when she was done with me, I carried my box back to my room and I sat down and I ripped every page into pieces. And from then, I was in 8th grade, I think. No, I didn't quit until the second time when I was a sophomore in high school. And my teacher had suggested that I write a realistic story, still my vein, and because I didn't stop then. But she said, why don't I try writing something realistic? And she suggested I send it into magazines to try out that aspect of writing. And I wrote about, these two kids at a birthday party for one of their friends. And I sent it to 17 magazine first. And I got a far better than an adult me would have expected back from Babette Rosemond, who was the editor at the time. And she gave me a number of really positive comments about how I could make it better, about professional layout, because I'd sent it on striped paper, school paper, and handwriting. She explained the professional format to me. But it was a wonderful, for all she turned it down, it was a wonderfully encouraging, supportive letter. And I have remembered her all these years for it. My mother asked me what I had gotten in the mail. And I gave it to her thinking she would be proud that I had had the courage to submit a realistic story to a professional magazine at my teacher's behest. That was around 5 o'clock or so in the afternoon. I don't know if she was drinking or not. I tried to run away and got halfway down the road to the highway and realized I was too terrified to try the road and strangers and being picked up and stuff like that. So I turned around and I went back. I did write after that. I wrote school papers. I wrote comedy for the school newspaper. I wrote a speech my senior year in college, high school, that won me an award locally. And I wrote well enough to get myself full scholarship into college. And summer before my junior year in college, I don't know what happened, But I sat down, and I had an affection for confession magazines, as they were called then. You know, the female heroine back at that time, it was a formula. You sin, you suffer, and you repent. And there were all kinds of ways you could sin and suffer and repent. And I did a high school senior, and a college guy who comes to study being a teacher, and they get involved, and they do the deed, and then he has a crisis of conscience because he's a seminarian, and he says, we got to break up, and she's heartbroken, and the town's turning their backs on her, but she decides to suck it up and go through with things and admit she was wrong and renew her interest in religion. And he comes back a year later and says, yeah, he dropped out of the seminar and he got his teaching degree and he wants to marry her. And it was supposed to be a takeoff. It was supposed to be a parody of a confession story. And my housemates had great fun with it. They read it aloud. And one of the girls they read it aloud to says, you know, Tammy, this is close enough. I think you should send it to magazines. And I wasn't doing anything much that summer, so I said, why the hell not? And the second magazine I sent it to bought it for $75, which in those days was a fortune. So I wrote another one, sold that. The third one I was getting to feel a little sick with sugar overdose. And I stopped doing it. But by then I knew that if I could write something properly and write it well with conviction, I could sell. And that was my senior year when I worked up the courage to take my first two and only writing classes. One in writing short stories with David Bradley Jr., who a year later would win the Penn Faulkner Award for his first novel, and one for writing for TV and film at Temple University, which aided me a great deal when I ended up writing radio plays.
So this kind of connects back to that whole idea that you never lost that spark, even
Right.
though you were, even though you had a time in your life when you couldn't write, when you just couldn't do it.
I couldn't do it. After a while, I even stopped trying, but I was reading fantasy and science fiction. I was reading history. I had immersed myself in the story of the Holocaust in my junior year. Anybody who's in the arts will tell you, there comes the moment where you just have to find out everything you can find about something. And it can be the Foreign Legion, it can be about baking scripture cakes, it can be about the type of houses built in Bali, it can be about anything in the world that may or may not be related to what you're doing at the time. It doesn't matter. Most of us, no matter what we're advised, will go after that subject, hammer and tongs, get all the pictures, see all the movies, listen to all the music, which ended up with people going, what is that you're playing? And I'm sitting there going, Tibetan music. You know, Hunhur too. They do pipe music, and they're there, that's music? I'm there, well, it grows on you. You know, or, Tammy, what are you reading now? I'm not telling you. Okay. After a while with me, they learned, if I say I'm not telling you, they really don't want to know. I spent 3 years eyebrow deep in the American War in Vietnam, tracing it all the way back to the French Foreign Legion in Africa and all the way forward to now. Some of my science fiction friends turned out to be veterans. One of them at Berkeley. She was one of the big protesters there. And other friends of mine in the banking industry were veterans from the military. So you never know what you'll find and what it will spark and what it will send off. And I just learned to stop questioning it. Even when I wasn't writing, if I wanted to find out something, and the first thing was that the massacre of the Jews in World War II, the same year I lost my writing. You have to find out. You have to find the books, the movies, the music, whatever. And you have to believe that someday you are going to need that stuff. And then I learned that when you get stuck for an idea, to sit back and start thinking of all the obsessions you've had back to the very first obsessions you remember, whether it was horseback riding or watching airplane shows when you were 6. To start thumbing, I always used to see it in my head as a card catalog. And I would whiffle through all the cards in their orders, and something would invariably pop up. And I would have my idea. I was stuck for an adversarial relationship in the 4th Alana book. And I was stuck. I needed Alana to walk in on a civil war and end up helping one side. And I was searching. And so I did the thing with the box and rifling through. And up pops Frances Fitzgerald, Fire on the Lake, her book about the war in Vietnam, the American war in Vietnam, but mostly about the relationship between the Green Berets and the Montagnard tribesmen of the Central Highlands, who had been fighting out both the North Vietnamese and the Central Vietnamese for centuries against extermination. And I looked at that and I went, I have my Civil War. Not only that, but from that I learned that I could base my cultures for those people on the cultures of the Montagnards and the Vietnamese. I could base the food on them, the names, the clothing. I had everything I needed to create a culture and a way of life and people. And that's how I've worked it ever since. And even before then, it's just go through your head, and what pops up, that's what you need.
So do you have any final advice for people? We're on the verge of Camp NaNoWriMo.
Oh, yay.
So do you have any advice to people who are going to try and take that plunge?
Okay, you're not going to like this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I say it every year and nobody listens to me. Not all of us are made for NaNoWriMo, which is why you've never seen me there. When they told me how long you had to write the book for NaNoWriMo, I laughed and I laughed and I laughed and I laughed, and finally somebody got me a wet cloth and somebody got me a fan, and I calmed down eventually. I can't do a book in 1 month, but there are people, writers I respect, who can, and I say, more power to you, babe. I can't do that. But on the other hand, I look at something like an itsy bitsy teeny weeny story like this. I can't do that either. I do what I like to do, what I can do, and if I want to venture abroad, I have places to venture. But NaNoWriMo, people will come to me with questions about the issues they're having. And one of the things I tell them, and I don't think they get very often, because they always look like they need smelling salts when I say this, is it's okay to quit. Not all of us are made for speed writing. Not all of us are made for writing in a month. You will learn. If you're a writer, the one thing you figure out, not immediately, but eventually, is that you learn with every word you put on paper or the back of your message book or anywhere else. You learn from every word, every sentence, every project you undertake. For school, for family, for giggles, anything. It all goes into this hopper up here. And sooner or later, you will need it and it will be there for you. So for NaNoWriMo, starting is always a pain in the butt. I always recommend, if you have trouble starting, try going to the first scene. That's where I always start my books. A lot of times the final version won't have that. My editors will ask me to put something before. But I like to start with my first scene that tells us something about the hero and something that tells us something about them and what they're getting into. Whether they meet one of the other main characters, or in Alana's case, she and her brother are finding out from their father that they're going to have to find another way to do what they want with their lives. I find that if you show people doing something, for one thing, that tells the reader way more about them than any explanation you give. We know Tom, Alana's brother, is a hothead because he talks like one and he acts like one. And we know Alana is stubborn because who's going to put up with all that grief for 4 years? And that's just the start, if she isn't pig-headed. I recommend, if you're bogged down, you're in trouble, you need to have something happen, but you don't know what, have a new character show up. And it doesn't even have to be a main character. It's nice, because then you motor ahead. But a new character, you learn so many new things about the character you're working with, your main characters. Writing books for kids gives me some leeway. And so for me, often a new character can be a baby, can be an animal, and I write fantasy, so it can be a god, it can be a monster. But somebody new forces not only your leads to act differently in relation to the new person, but your regular characters start reacting to each other differently depending on how they see you interacting. You start to interact differently. And also when the newcomer is difficult, like a baby or an animal, you learn something about that person and about yourself that you did not know before. Have something happen. The old adage is have a burglar come through the door. Have a war break out. The woman who wrote Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell, she got a lot of mileage, not over the fighting, but over what the people were doing to supply the fighters. She got a lot of drama out of it and a lot of sadness. Have them go somewhere. People run into trouble on the road. People, when they get somewhere, they find that it's not what they hoped for. They may decide to go home. You don't know how your character's going to act. And oh, by the way, if you're trying to do something with your character And your character who's happily gone la 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 and done everything you've asked, suddenly, not doing it. Yeah, I hate that. No, you're going to write garbage. Listen to your character. I know it sounds loony, because after all, the character comes from you, of course. There isn't a writer in the world who actually believes that. We all, somewhere inside us, even though we'll lie, especially the academics, because they like to take the fun out of it. But the character, the character will show you where they want to go, where their own personality, if you've thought them out right. And I base characters on real people. I started with, I found myself in my first book, the characters all looked and sounded alike. And since I was writing in ancient Troy, I knew that couldn't be right. So I started basing characters on the people I knew. True, they were from Burlingame, California in the 1960s, but I knew what their eyes looked like, what their hair was like, what their skin tone was like. I knew what colors they wore. I knew if they were athletic. I knew if they had bad tempers. And from that, I could build up. And the thing is, no matter who you pick, and then when I started running out of people I knew, I moved on to TV performers, the characters they played, musicians, public figures.
Poker players.
Poker players. Martial artists. The thing is, by the time you've worked with a character long enough, and sometimes long enough as a sentence or a paragraph, they become their own person to you. And you can trust them to tell you when you're going astray. They will feel real to you. And that will guide you further in your story than your own forcing it will guide you. If you base a character on somebody, do not tell them. Lie. If they pester you about, oh, come on, yeah, I know you, I know what you do, that's me. Lie a lot. I have broken my rule on occasion. Or someone has broken it for me.
I have no shame.
None. Zilch, zero. But because the thing is, your nearest and dearest, you'd be surprised at what they would take offense at. Even if it's you to the life, even if it's them. It may be a part of them they didn't think people noticed, or they haven't noticed, and they really don't like it being out there. So don't tell them. Ever. And I don't care how, oh, come on, I know that's me. I know I've said that before. Lie. If you're bad at it like me, practice in a mirror, and I do. Lie. Keep lying. Don't break it. You'll be happy you did.
I think that's enough for one day.
Okie dokie.
Want to say goodbye?
Good night.